The overhead lights in the boardroom washed every surface in a cold, clinical glare, turning familiar faces into sharp silhouettes. My father sat at the head of the table, hands folded with the kind of authority he never needed to raise his voice to enforce. When he finally spoke, his tone carried the same unshakable certainty that had shaped my childhood. "You're suspended until you apologize to your sister." A pen froze mid-scratch. Several colleagues exchanged looks, but not one of them dared step in. My sister leaned back, attempting to appear wounded, but the small curl at the corner of her mouth betrayed her satisfaction. She didn't need to speak, she had already won. I pressed the button on my presentation remote, even though the screen remained frozen on the same unfinished slide. A small, defiant click echoed in the silent room. I didn't protest. I didn't ask for fairness. I simply said, "All right." If my father had understood what those two quiet syllables would set in motion, he might have chosen silence instead. Growing up, I learned early that in our home, quiet wasn't peace, it was hierarchy. My sister understood it too, long before I realized the rules had been written without my consent. When she cried during a group project fiasco in school, she came home with new supplies and a smile. I came home with a lecture about being the reasonable one. Reasonable. The word became my role, my armor, and eventually, my cage. Years later, when my acceptance letter arrived, a thick, promising envelope with my name perfectly centered, I held it with trembling excitement. My father skimmed the first line, nodded once, and placed it beside the grocery coupons. 10 minutes later, my sister flashed an engagement ring, and the house burst into celebration before he even finished reading page 1. My achievement vanished under a pile of champagne napkins. My mother had been the only one who noticed the invisible work I did, the weight I carried. When she passed, the imbalance sharpened. Without her quiet understanding, the house grew colder, and my father's blind spot widened. My sister didn't change, she just had less resistance. And in the family business, the pattern repeated itself with higher stakes. She mastered the art of promising what she didn't understand. I mastered fulfilling impossible expectations. My father always sided with the one who handles relationships, and I always became the one who handled everything else. But that day in the boardroom, something shifted. And what followed next shattered a lifetime of enforced silence. But what exactly happened after I walked out of that room, and why did it shake the entire company? Stay with me. Part 2 reveals the first crack in the foundation. Before we continue the story, please tell me in the comments what your name is and where you are listening from, and please like the video and subscribe to the channel for such amazing content. The hallway outside the conference room felt colder than it should have, as if the building itself sensed a fault line forming beneath its polished floors. People stepped aside when I passed, not out of respect, but out of unease. No one said my name. No one met my eyes. It was the same kind of silence I'd grown up with, the kind that smoothed over conflict instead of addressing it. When I reached my floor, a printed memo taped beside the elevator caught my eye. A new project chart. A new chain of command. My sister's name gleamed at the top of a department I had built from scratch, the department she had never contributed a single late night to. My name was missing completely, as if I had been erased rather than suspended. It wasn't an oversight. It was a rewrite. My phone buzzed. First message, "Are you okay?" Second, "Do we still follow your timeline?" Third, "They're saying a lot upstairs." I turned the screen face down on my desk. The vibrations continued anyway, a constant reminder that while the executives played politics, my team was left with the mess. Minutes later, my father called. Not to ask how I felt. Not to ask what happened. But to discuss optics. His voice had that same tone he used when I was a child asking why my sister always got the better slice of everything, patient, patronizing, rehearsed. "Just keep the peace," he said. "Family comes first." Family. The word sounded weightless coming from someone who treated loyalty like a currency he could spend however he pleased. I hung up before the familiar ache could settle. A shadow appeared in my doorway. My sister. She didn't knock. She never had. You can end this, she said, her voice dipped in false softness. Just apologize. She brushed imaginary lint from her sleeve, glanced at her reflection in my dark computer monitor, and smiled at herself, a small, confident smirk polished from years of never facing consequences. I'd watched that smirk my entire life. It always meant the same thing. She expected to win. But something inside me shifted, not anger, not grief, something steadier. A final internal click, like a lock turning. I reached for my portfolio, closed my laptop, and stood up. That's it? She asked, startled. I nodded once. And then I gave her a word she never expected, a word that had once meant compliance, but not anymore. All right. I walked past her without hesitation. Behind me, she finally spoke, her voice cracking for the first time. What does that mean? She didn't understand it yet. But she would. Because the moment I reached my office, the quiet plan I'd been building for years finally began, and it was something no one in my family would see coming. My office felt strangely unfamiliar when I stepped inside, as if the room itself sensed the shift in me. The glass walls, the framed degrees, the hum of machines, everything looked the same, yet nothing was the same. For years, this space had anchored me. Now it felt like the last stop before a departure I had delayed far too long. I closed the door gently, letting the latch click into place. Such a small sound. Yet it felt like drawing a line with permanent ink. I slipped the hair tie from my wrist and gathered my hair back, a quiet ritual I always used before beginning difficult work. Then I pulled open the top desk drawer and started packing. Not in a rush. Not in panic. Just with the steady clarity of someone who had finally stopped bargaining with herself. The first documents I gathered were the ones I never trusted anyone else to manage: project scopes, risk assessments, contract notes, timelines scribbled at midnight, breakdowns I had created to salvage promises my sister had tossed around like confetti. Every detail I had carried alone, every burden they had assumed I would absorb. One by one, each folder went into a neat row on the desk. Order. Evidence. Truth. My framed degrees came next. I wrapped them carefully in tissue paper, the same degrees my father never acknowledged, but the company depended on. Awards followed. Certifications. The small markers of a career built on discipline rather than spectacle. As the walls emptied, my laptop chimed repeatedly. Messages. Notifications. Missed calls. My team was trying to understand what had happened. Other departments wanted answers. People who had sat in that meeting, pretending not to see, wanted to ease their guilt with private concern. I turned the laptop face down. Silence had always been cleaner. Then I opened a fresh document. Not to plead, not to defend, but to finalize. A resignation letter. Crisp, concise, emotionless. A clean severing of ties that had frayed long before today. But the real work wasn't the letter. It was what came next. I accessed the shared drive and began assembling everything the company had ignored for years. A full compilation. Project histories. Resource allocations. Contract discrepancies. Budget gaps. Email chains with overlooked warnings. Every instance where my sister had promised outcomes that defied technical reality. I added nothing. I embellished nothing. I simply held up a mirror. 2 hours passed like a single exhale. By the time I finished, the file wasn't a complaint, it was a record. An undeniable one. My fingers hovered above the send button, but not with hesitation. With precision. Timing mattered. When I finally clicked send, the silence broke. Within seconds, calls flooded in, the company lawyer, the board, department heads, 2 clients. I ignored every one of them. Then I moved through the room, collecting the final items, the pens, notebooks, the coffee mug my team had given me last winter. I left only one thing behind, a prototype from a project my team saved years ago. 40 hours of work compressed into 2 days. A symbol of what real effort looked like, effort my family never saw. I placed it upright, dusted it gently, and left it exactly where it belonged. That was the moment footsteps rushed toward my office. Because when my sister burst through the doorway, breathless and terrified, she realized too late that I wasn't just leaving, I had already rewritten the entire game. My sister appeared in the doorway like a storm that had arrived too late. Her breath came fast, as if she had sprinted down the hallway, and her eyes moved frantically from the half-empty walls to the boxes lined neatly on my desk. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice too sharp for the calm around her. I didn't answer. I slid the final folder into my portfolio and closed it with a soft click. Her gaze followed every movement like someone watching a fuse burn toward an explosion she couldn't stop. "You didn't tell Dad, did you?" Her voice cracked. "You didn't send anything, right?" I carried the portfolio to the chair and placed it beside my bag, then turned to her fully for the first time that day. She stepped inside, crossing a boundary she had never respected. "You can't leave," she insisted. "Dad won't allow it. You're overreacting. You're punishing everyone for one mistake." I raised an eyebrow. "One mistake?" She froze. Because we both knew it wasn't one. It was every promise she had made without understanding, every shortcut she had taken, every crisis she had shifted onto me, all stitched together into one inevitable collapse. "You're making a huge deal out of nothing," she said, trying again, her voice softer now. "You've always fixed things. You always come around." There it was, her truth. She didn't want me. She wanted my labor. "I'm not fixing anything this time," I replied. She opened her mouth to argue, ready to twist the narrative until she became the victim and I became unreasonable. But the words never formed. Her eyes drifted to my empty shelves, the cleared desk, the stripped walls. The reality finally caught her. This wasn't a threat. It was done. "You can't just walk away," she whispered. "What about the Hamilton contract? What about the launch? We're depending on you." I picked up my laptop bag. "Depend on your team," I said. "They were yours the moment you took the title." Her expression collapsed into something raw, confusion mixed with fear. She had always assumed I would stay. I was the constant. The anchor. The one who cleaned what she broke quietly, invisibly. "Dad will fix this," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "That's the problem," I replied. "He's your shield. Not mine." I stepped past her, and she didn't move this time. She only stared at the empty office behind me, the vacant proof of a role she never understood. When I reached the hallway, her voice followed me, small, fragile. "What did you send?" I paused but didn't turn back. "Everything you ignored." Her gasp echoed off the glass walls, sharp and hollow. I walked away, each step steady and controlled. But the moment I reached the elevator, I could feel it, the building was shifting. Whispers. Footsteps. Doors opening. Someone had finally checked their email. Because by the time I stepped into the elevator, the board had already begun calling an emergency meeting, and this time I wasn't the one on trial. By the time I reached the executive floor, the atmosphere had shifted so sharply it felt like walking into a room where a bomb had already gone off. The whispers had multiplied. Heads turned as I passed. No one tried to hide the panic now. They were too busy choosing sides in a conflict they never expected to witness. My father's assistant stood near the conference room door, clutching a folder as if it were a lifeline. "He wants to see you," she said, but the tremor in her voice revealed the truth. This wasn't a request. This was damage control. I walked past her without answering. The conference room door was already open. Inside, the tension hung heavy, dense enough to feel in the air. My father stood at the far end of the table, shoulders rigid, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. Beside him sat the company lawyer, laptop open, fingers perched like he'd been typing nonstop since dawn. A paralegal waited in the corner, documenting everything with quiet precision. My sister hovered near the window, arms crossed tightly, her expression twisted into something brittle. She wasn't smirking anymore. She looked like someone standing on a trapdoor, waiting for it to drop. When I stepped inside, no one spoke. Not until I sat down. My father tried first. "We can work this out," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "Let's be rational." Rational. The word almost made me laugh. I placed my portfolio on the table. The soft thud echoed like a verdict. "I'm here to finalize my resignation." The lawyer inhaled sharply. The paralegal paused mid-keystroke. My sister blinked, the first visible crack in her confidence. "You don't need to do this," my father insisted. But I was already opening the portfolio. I pulled out the resignation letter and placed it on the table between us. "I'm activating the clauses tied to suspension without cause," I said evenly. "Including full vesting." The lawyer's eyes widened. He had read the contract thoroughly. He understood the implications. My father hadn't. My sister stepped forward, biting back frustration. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "You're blowing everything out of proportion. All you had to do was apologize." I slid another folder toward the center of the table. The room went still. It was the documentation. All of it. The lawyer hesitated before opening it. But when he did, color drained from his face. This is extensive," he whispered. My sister leaned over his shoulder, flipping through page after page, timelines, budget discrepancies, conflict logs, overpromised deadlines, her own email chains exposing every false assurance she had made. "You can't send this to clients," she hissed. "I already did," I said softly. Her hand froze midair. "What?" My father's eyes snapped to mine, horrified. "You blindsided us." "No," I replied. "I revealed what you ignored." The lawyer finally spoke, voice low and strained. "Legally, she's within her rights. Nothing she shared violates confidentiality." My sister whipped toward him. "So she gets to walk away after ruining everything?" I closed the portfolio calmly. "I didn't ruin anything. I just stopped cleaning up your mess." My father looked between us, helpless. "We can still fix this," he said. I stood. "I already did." Because what happened next wasn't an argument, it was the moment they realized the company they controlled couldn't function without the daughter they had never truly seen, and the fallout was only just beginning. I walked out of the conference room before anyone could form a coherent response. The door eased shut behind me, sealing their panic inside like a pressure cooker ready to burst. The hallway felt unnaturally still. People glanced up from their desks, some with curiosity, some with concern, others with the sharp awareness that something irreversible had just occurred. I didn't slow down. Every step through that building felt like shedding a weight I had carried for years. By the time I reached the lobby, the whispers had already changed tone. No longer confusion. No longer speculation. Recognition. People were beginning to understand that the structure they trusted had been held together by invisible labor, mine. Outside, the air hit my face cool and fresh, like the world wasn't aware that an entire chapter of my life had just collapsed behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The collapse was inevitable, they were just finally forced to see it. When I reached home, the quiet felt different. Not oppressive. Not loaded. Just quiet. A simple, steady silence that didn't demand anything from me. My dog, Cooper, trotted across the hardwood floor the moment I walked in, nails clicking rhythmically. He never cared about titles or deadlines or impossible expectations. He cared that I was home, and that was enough. I leaned down and rubbed his ears, feeling the tension melt from my shoulders in a way I hadn't felt in years. Then I poured a glass of water and stood in my living room, staring at the soft stretch of evening sunlight as it slid across the walls. It felt unreal, almost cinematic, like stepping into a life I didn't know I was allowed to have. For the first time in years, I wasn't troubleshooting. I wasn't preparing for fallout. I wasn't anticipating the next crisis my sister would manufacture. The silence wasn't punishment. It was permission. I spent the evening organizing the documents on my dining table, clean stacks, clear categories, everything in order. Not because I owed it to them, but because I owed it to myself to finish with clarity. One stack for contracts. One for payments. One for timelines. One for the resignation letter waiting for my signature. I hesitated for only a moment before picking up the pen. Not out of doubt, but because the motion itself felt symbolic, a ritual closing of a door I'd been afraid to acknowledge for years. My signature glided across the page, unshaken. Just like that, a lifetime of silent obedience was over. Later that night, I lay on the couch, Cooper curled at my feet. I didn't check emails. I didn't scroll. I didn't replay the conference room scene. I simply breathed. And for the first time in my adult life, breathing didn't feel like bracing. The next morning, I woke with a clarity so unfamiliar it startled me. I dressed without urgency, chose clothes that didn't need to broadcast authority to anyone. The sky outside was bright and unhurried. Today wasn't a fight. It wasn't a cleanup job. It was a beginning. As I drove toward the meeting with the company that had reached out earlier, I realized something simple but profound. Leaving wasn't destruction. It was direction. But even as I stepped into my new future, I didn't know that the fallout from yesterday's truth bomb was unraveling everything back at my old company, and they were about to come looking for the one person who could stop it. The new company's office was bright, open, and buzzing with an energy I hadn't felt in years. Conversations flowed easily. People moved with purpose, not panic. There was no tension hiding beneath polite smiles, no unspoken hierarchy dictating who mattered and who didn't. When the hiring manager greeted me, there was no calculation in her eyes. No comparison between me and my sister. Just a genuine handshake and a warm, "We're really glad you came." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I had spent so long being evaluated against someone else's pedestal that simple professionalism felt like luxury. She led me through their workspace, natural light, collaborative nooks, whiteboards filled with actual strategy instead of vague promises. When she introduced me to their engineering team, no one looked past me in search of someone more important. They simply smiled, shook my hand, and welcomed me in. It took me a few seconds to understand the sensation building in my chest. Relief. Real, steady relief. As I stood near a wall of floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, the hiring manager asked, "What made you finally leave your last company?" I looked at the skyline, the same city where I had spent years fixing disasters someone else created, where my value had been so underestimated it took a collapse for anyone to see it. "I stopped mistaking loyalty for obligation," I said softly. She nodded like she understood more than I said, and for the first time in a long time I felt seen not for my role, but for my ability. My choices. After the meeting ended with a contract draft and a timeline for onboarding, I stepped outside feeling lighter, almost buoyant. The city felt new, like it was offering me something rather than demanding something from me. My phone buzzed. Then buzzed again. And again. Calls. Messages. Voicemails. All from the same source, my father, the company lawyer, 2 board members, even a senior engineer who had never spoken to me unless he needed something. I didn't answer. Not yet. When I finally listened to the first voicemail, my father's voice was taut with urgency. "We need to talk. Things have escalated." The next message came from a board member. "We discovered significant inconsistencies in the Hamilton account. We need clarification immediately." Then the lawyer. "There are questions only you can answer. The situation is deteriorating." And finally, the message that cut through everything, a text from one of my team members. "They're blaming you for the delays. Your sister said the documents you sent were incomplete. People are panicking." There it was. Not shock. Not surprise. Just confirmation. They hadn't learned. They were reverting to the same pattern: protect my sister, sacrifice me. Even after the truth had detonated in their laps. But this time, something was different. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel guilt. I didn't feel responsibility. I felt clarity. I stood on the sidewalk, sunlight warming my face, and understood the truth they were only beginning to grasp. The company was collapsing because the foundation had always been cracked, they just never noticed until the person silently holding it up stepped away. But everything came to a head when I returned one final time, not to help, not to fix, but to close the door fully, and what happened in that last confrontation changed the entire family forever. When I stepped into the building for the last time, the atmosphere was nothing like the day before. The lobby buzzed with frantic movement, hushed conversations, and the strained tension of people trying to make sense of a storm still unfolding. No one tried to stop me. No one asked where I was going. They just watched, as if they already knew this wasn't a return. It was a closure. The elevator doors opened to the executive floor, and the moment I stepped out, the noise hit me like a wall. Papers shuffled. Phones rang nonstop. A cluster of executives argued in harsh whispers. Someone muttered my name, not with authority, but with desperation. My father's assistant nearly stumbled toward me. "They're waiting for you," she said, relief and fear tangled in her voice. I didn't answer. I walked straight into the conference room. The scene inside was chaos disguised as formality. My father looked older than he had 2 days ago, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow. The company lawyer flipped rapidly through documents. A board member paced the length of the room. My sister sat rigidly at the end of the table, pale and visibly rattled. Her eyes locked onto mine immediately. "You have to fix this," she whispered, a crack in her voice betraying her panic. I took a seat without rushing, placed my portfolio calmly on the table, and folded my hands. "What exactly," I said, "do you think I'm here to fix?" My sister shot to her feet. "The board thinks we misrepresented deliverables. The clients are furious. They say the timelines were unrealistic. They say the truth," I interrupted gently. She froze, mouth open. The lawyer cleared his throat. "We need clarification. The documents you sent were complete," I finished. "You're dealing with the consequences of decisions you approved without understanding them." My father